Unity Water is proud to sponsor this podcast series because we believe great news, great solutions and great outcomes deserve to be shared. See what we're all about at unitywater.com. You're listening to the Australian Water Association's podcast series.
I'm Hazel Flynn, and joining me now is Rachel Watson, Senior Research Consultant at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney, here to talk about the tricky question of recycled water pricing. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
Now, it is increasingly being considered worldwide, water reuse, and yet the issue of pricing remains tricky. Why so?
Well, I think one of the key issues that we have is we quite often treat recycled water quite differently to the way that we treat water and wastewater services. So we treat it with a different level of risk, and quite often we look at it as an additional extra, and we really have a lot of questions around the viability of individual projects on their own merits rather than looking at the system as a whole, which is something that we don't really do when we look at water and wastewater infrastructure. Some of the other challenges we have are balancing developing new markets for recycled water, along with the different drivers for recycled water programs at different times, leaving a legacy of different pricing and cost recovery mechanisms that send very different signals to both customers, regulators and utilities.
Yes, well, how does that interplay work? You know, thinking about recycled water pricing, the interplay between customers, the wider community and the water utilities and the regulators.
There's a lot of different competing demands and different perspectives out there. There's a lot of focus at the moment in the water industry on customer willingness to pay, and that can often bring up some very interesting questions for both the utilities and the customers, particularly when we're talking about new developments where the customers don't exist yet. And one of the things I think is really important is we often ask our question, will they be willing to pay, and what's the viability of the scheme, but we often don't ask ourselves a question of what's the impact if we don't start investing in these schemes, what's the outcome going to be? And up to date we've seen a few developments go in across all states of Australia with urban densification, where we really haven't provided the right type of water environments, and these are going to be very hot and uncomfortable places to live, particularly in summer periods as we get drier and hotter. And incorporating water into land planning at the very beginning and having recycled water, retaining water in our urban landscape is a very important thing, and we need to think about why we're not doing it rather than why we should do it.
An interesting point. Clearly we need to get a little bit smarter about how we're handling it. Victoria is the area where you've studied some efforts being done, and Victoria actually had a policy push on recycled water in 2002, didn't it?
Yes, it did. So the policy push originally for recycled water came from a wastewater driver, so a driver to protect their Port Phillip Bay and their local waterways. So this push actually came a little bit before the drought, and that's typical of a lot of recycled water schemes actually that were established before that period, that were really driven by long-term wastewater drivers and protecting our waterways. I think a lot of people have forgotten that as we've moved into the period of drought, where recycled water has become all about water security. But water security, particularly in a country where we depend a lot on surface water supplies, is something that comes and goes with time. Protecting our waterways and providing nice, cool, green, beautiful urban environments that retain water in the landscape is something that goes on day, year on year. And so we really need to take our focus away from just thinking of recycled water as something that provides a water security option and something that provides an integrated, holistic way of providing water services.
And as I say, you looked at Victorian cases. You looked at attempts made by two different Victorian utilities to address recycled water pricing. Who were they and what did they do?
Okay, so our case studies looked at Yarra Valley Water and South East Water. They're both retail water utilities in Melbourne. So they both have slightly different recycled water histories and outcomes. So Yarra Valley Water has a much more recent foray into recycled water. So their recycled water schemes really started to only come online in the mid-2000s, particularly pushed by drought, and they're mainly residential schemes in that area. The South East Water region has a much longer history of recycled water, and that has stemmed from the fact that they had quite a lot of communities on the urban fringes, and their recycled water was much more a way of managing wastewater in an efficient way and protecting the waterway outcomes. So a lot of their recycled water schemes have an initial focus on irrigation, but since the drought they have then moved on to residential and industrial schemes. So two areas who are both increasing their recycled water going into the future and have had some very successful schemes, and also have been really willing to learn from the schemes that they have put in the past.
So different challenges there and different approaches. What did you see that worked really well, and what was tried that didn't work quite so well?
Okay, so one of the things in Yarra Valley is that they're servicing in some new growth areas, and if they had have taken a very pure financial approach to one of these new growth areas, the best thing for them to do would have been to let Melbourne Water, who's the major wastewater and water supply utility in Melbourne, build big pipelines and take all the water away from their communities. And that would have cost, the big trunk main would have cost about $100 million. But the best outcome for their customers, and from a whole of community perspective, which this approach Yarra Valley took, was actually to plan for a whole heap of several decentralised treatment plants and have recycled water off them. So despite some of the challenges set up in the institutional framework, because they took that holistic approach for their customers, they've been able to justify going ahead with a different approach and actually saving quite a lot of money. So that scheme pays for itself.
So, and what about the other utility that you were mentioning?
Yeah, so Southeast Water. So as I said, some of their irrigation schemes started as a way of managing wastewater in some of the urban fringe areas. And one of the real challenges with those types of schemes is to balance the demand for recycled water with the generation of wastewater. And it can be quite challenging because, of course, the climate changes seasonally, and wastewater generation tends to not change seasonally. So they've designed some quite innovative pricing arrangements that incentivise the irrigators to create the storage on their sites to so they charge a lesser price in the off irrigation season, and they charge a higher price in the irrigation season when more people want it. So there's a balance of infrastructure investment between both them and the irrigators. So that was one very interesting thing that I saw there. And the other interesting thing that I saw with Southeast Water was quite often when we set up recycled water schemes, there's a demand risk. So often that demand risk for recovering the cost of the scheme lies with the person who invests in the scheme, so the utilities. But some of the contracts they've set up there are take or pay contracts, so that especially with large irrigator customers and businesses, so that the business knows their business and the demand that they'll be having into the future. So they take on that, quite rightly, they take on that demand risk, and the utility takes on the risk of operating the system. So that was a quite innovative win-win arrangement for some of those contracts.
So how was customer engagement handled?
Okay, so in Victoria, the Victorian price regulator has recently brought in a new incentive mechanism to encourage the utilities to really change their focus from their pipes and their assets to what their customers want. And so through this process, all the utilities in Victoria have had to deeply engage with their customers to understand exactly what they want. And from this engagement process, despite the fact that Yarra Valley Water and Southeast Water took quite different approaches, they both found out some very interesting things from their customers about what they wanted for recycled water. Yarra Valley found out from their customers that they really valued the idea of having two different types of water: high quality water for drinking and a lower quality of water for garden watering and toilet flushing and clothes washing. And that really emphasises the community's passion for fit for purpose water. On the other hand, Southeast Water, when they were talking to their customers, they found out that there was quite a different perception between customers who had recycled water and customers who didn't have recycled water. So overall, all customers were interested in South East Water continuing to investigate non-potable uses for recycled water, and there was a moderate interest in them expanding their programs. But customers who had recycled water knew that they were doing their bit for the environment, but thought they should get a discount on because it wasn't quite as good as the potable water, which is interesting because that's still a common theme, even though during the drought all the Victorian utilities were actually charging as much for recycled water as they were for potable water. But the customers who weren't already receiving recycled water actually really wanted to have recycled water, and they also thought the recycled water use should be expanded, but they weren't very happy to subsidise very much other people using recycled water. There was one really notable exception to this, and that was that there was a really high interest in providing and expanding recycled water programs to farmers. And this was perhaps thought to be a perception that farmers really struggled during the drought, and that would be exacerbated by climate change into the future. So South East Water are continuing to talk to their customers to find out what they expect in that regard.
Well, it sounds like there were lots of interesting lessons to be shared from what those two utilities experienced, because obviously recycled water, the thinking has changed, but it's going to continue to change, and your work is suggesting that we should be looking at why not do it rather than why do it.
That's correct, and I think that's one of the things for me that I find most exciting about the approach taken in Victoria, with the focus of the utilities really talking to their customers, and the risk for them is not delivering on what their customers do, rather than the old approach of it being risky to go above minimum standards and do something extra for your customers. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that approach plays out and seeing lots more recycled water into the future.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming in and talking to us.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you. And that was Rachel Watson, Senior Research Consultant at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney. And thanks for joining us.